Social Impact CX, the podcast that helps you drive mission and make a difference with customer experience.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for the Social Impact CX podcast. I'm John Corrigan, and I'll be your guide to how you can drive mission and achieve social impact with customer experience work. This is episode 31 of Social Impact CX, and again, as always, I really do appreciate that you're listening. Thanks. This episode of Social Impact CX is specifically focused on an important subject that I don't think you always hear about as an initial consideration in customer experience work, but that is really important and should be a key consideration right up front at the beginning of any CX initiative, in my opinion. I'm talking about the subject of cultural differences. After all, how can you really gain empathy for someone you'd like to help, if you've not taken into account key cultural differences that are critical to understanding that person and their experiences, your client or beneficiary or customer or patient or whomever it is that you're working to serve? So to explore this topic of cultural differences, I've enlisted the help of an expert. Sabine Harnau is based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and she has done extensive work in the UK as well as around the world. She runs a consultancy called From Scratch Communications that is focused on customer-centric message strategy. And at the core of her work, Sabine brings a focus to cultural differences. I was so glad to connect with Sabine as a customer-centric professional based in Europe, and it's really great to go transcontinental with Social Impact CX for the first time with a kindred spirit in Amsterdam. I know that there are Social Impact CX listeners in the Netherlands, and so I find it very exciting to have Sabine on Social Impact CX as the first interview conducted outside of the U.S. that I've done. I think Sabine's global experience really provides some great insights in planning for and then accommodating for cultural differences. And while it might be easy to understand how you need to make adjustments in your work when projects span countries such as the Netherlands and Germany and France and the UK, for everyone in the United States, I think it's just as important to consider cultural differences when working across geographies: New York, California, Texas, the Midwest. And, cultural differences certainly go well beyond geography, especially when you consider gender or generational differences or any other number of cultural categories. At the end of the day, gaining empathy to better serve a key group of customers or beneficiaries is most likely an exercise in creating a better understanding and more empathy related to cultural differences. That is, if you really want to be successful. I had an interesting conversation with Sabine recently and have broken the conversation into 2 episodes. Episode 31 is the first part of our discussion about why cultural differences matter for customer experience work. That's among other subjects we cover. Part 2 of the discussion will be in a second episode, and I'll be posting that soon. And before we get to Sabine, I can't forget about my moment of gratitude that I always include at the beginning of every episode for Social Impact CX. I have to say that I'm indeed grateful for Twitter, because without the global reach of Twitter, I probably would not have crossed paths with Sabine. And so for that global reach and the ability to connect with each other wherever it is that you're located, I'm very grateful for this powerful platform that Twitter provides. We have social platforms in our lives, and I think people forget about how amazing it is that we can all connect when we find a common interest and common bonds. And so, without further delay, here's part 1 of my conversation on cultural differences and customer experience work with Sabine Harnau. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Social Impact CX podcast. I'm very pleased to welcome Sabine Harnau to Social Impact CX. Sabine is a copywriter and a trainer based in Amsterdam, and she speaks both German and English fluently. I think she does fairly well with Dutch as well. Sabine is founder of a consultancy called From Scratch, and she has done work around the world. In fact, Sabine has done many things over the years, notably including a fairly significant portion of her career with Lego, the global toy company Lego. But these days, she's rather focused on advising her clients on customer-centric messaging strategy. So before I go much further, I'll let Sabine say hello and tell us a bit more about her background and what she focuses on in her work.
Well, hello, and thank you, John, for this extremely lovely introduction. Yeah, great, thank you. And I'm very happy to be on your podcast and talk a bit about global customer experience and cultural differences. So you said to tell you a bit more about my background and what I focus on. I think that's best summarized by saying I help change makers communicate with people who are quite different from them. And typically, I do that through one-on-one coaching, team workshops, or copywriting projects. And that started around 2 years ago when I started from scratch, because that's my company name, because I was frustrated with agency life. I was really keen to work with fewer people, more hand-selected clients who do things that I really admire. And I also wanted to do my best work. And that to me always starts from scratch rather than with copy pasting best practice.
That is great. Anything else about your background? What did
Sure.
you do with Lego?
So yeah, at the time when I started my own company, I'd already collected a few years of experience working agency side. And before that, I'd started and led the first copy team at Lego customer service globally. So I knew what it's like to be the client as well, which was for me the perfect background for building my own boutique business where customer experience comes first.
That's great. I think it's always my background before recording Social Impact CX and working on my startup journey map included. I've been vice president of marketing for a couple different software companies, and so I've hired a lot of agencies. And I think people who have that experience from the agency side and the client side, corporate world, I think it's a great perspective to have. So, all right. So, just for our listeners, this is the first transcontinental recording of the Impact CX podcast. Sabine's calling in from Amsterdam, and I'd like to give a big shout out to all of the Social Impact CX listeners in the Netherlands. I can see you on our analytics that we follow, and so thank you for joining. I always appreciate everyone from the Netherlands listening in. So Sabine, you and I met in a very interesting way. I hope you don't mind if I share.
No, not at all.
So
Go ahead.
I was catching up on Twitter, and I discovered that I had gotten this really nice direct message from Sabine. Sabine had DM'd me about how she enjoyed the Social Impact CX podcast and how important it is to spread the word about good customer experience practices in the impact community. And of course, that's what Social Impact CX is all about. So I replied back to thank her for a message, and I asked, I wanted to know what she might find interesting for me to cover in future episodes of Social Impact CX. And Sabine suggested cultural differences, which I thought was a fantastic idea. So Sabine, since it was your suggestion, but I certainly agree with that, I'd love to hear from you as to why cultural differences are so important to consider in customer experience work, or as you put it, global customer experience work. I think it's a local issue too. It's country specific, and then even how would you define cultural differences? So if you could just share a little bit with us.
Yeah, that is a great question, and probably easiest if I kind of go back to the very beginning, like the beginning of each one of us. As humans, we're always a product of two major influences, nature and nurture. There's the DNA, our body, the electrics, the chemistry of how we function, which is all mostly nature. But as soon as we're born, we're thrown into this ocean of impressions: language, touch, food, smells, music, customs, how we're dressed or how we're swaddled as babies, who cares for us if we're left crying, picked up immediately. All of those are just some examples of nurture, and taken together, all those shape a culture. And as we grow up, we socialize along, what's sometimes been called societal fault lines, according to our ethnicity, geographic location, gender, religion, class, age, education. And they also overlap to a certain extent. So each one of us is a mix of subcultural influences and a unique individual at the same time. Yeah.
You touched on some things that are so important when you think of these societal fault lines, which you need to be conscious of when you're thinking about the experiences that someone's having with your organization, whatever service or product it is you're providing. If you really think about diversity and inclusion, it's hard to, I think, do work in the best way possible if you don't understand some of these fault lines. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and I think what makes it so hard is that we're all products of our cultures. We swim in culture as fish swim in water. It's kind of invisible to us. And that is where potential bias starts to creep in. And customer centricity is really in danger of getting lost. So it's not something where we don't want to be customer centric, or we don't want to be inclusive and sensitive to diversity. It's just that our own bias and our own blindness sometimes creates that accidentally.
Well, I agree with that. And if you understand what customer experience work is all about, it is all about empathy. It starts with empathy. And so I think you're laying the groundwork here for a really important fundamental concept to doing good customer experience work. And that understanding cultural differences, I think, is all about empathy, just like customer experience work is.
Yeah. So why I like to focus on cultural differences is because I think when you know about some trends and patterns, it's easier to see what is actually individual. And then you can, on the one hand, you can use trends to shape experiences for a certain subgroup or a geographical region, but then you also get to ask better questions when you're working with individuals. You get a better entry point to a really customer-centric approach. And you get used to asking about the customer first as well, rather than starting with imposing your own preference and your own bias on them.
Right. That's so important. So you've worked with a lot of different organizations and have some really interesting experiences in your background. Do you have any examples you can share about good or bad, about mistakes that you've seen that have happened from poor consideration of cultural differences, or good outcomes that have happened by people focusing on cultural differences?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually one of the things that I always pay attention to. And just recently, what I noticed is sometimes there's a bit of a misunderstanding around this, what is the individual and what is the culture that people are in, and what is politics and what is kind of historically grown. So I always love to share these kind of stories just to bring it a little bit to life. Where I see the most good examples happening is when we're talking about a market that feels extremely different from the company's home ground. Like, for example, if you're based in Europe or America and you're selling to China or Singapore, then it's more likely that you'll at least be aware that there's a potential cultural difference. And you'll prepare a little bit better for that. And I've seen that working with the projects that I've been involved in, like both at Lego, but also as an external advisor to other companies that are operating globally. And what they always did to make it work really well is listening to local team members and local customers as well, and really taking them seriously. That said, though, even when it's really far away from your home ground, things can still go horribly wrong. I don't know if you saw that in the last couple of months, but there's this infamous Dolce & Gabbana video, which is aimed at the Chinese market. So basically, Italian fashion company wants to advertise in China and creates a video showing Chinese women who are struggling to eat pizza and pasta with chopsticks. And to make it even worse, there's a man telling them how to do it right. It's horribly insensitive. It rightly caused a scandal. And I think it just shows how important it is, if you do want to win the hearts and minds of people abroad, and also, from gender also plays a role in this, of course. So I think this one is just a really bad example.
Wow, I've not seen that commercial. I don't know that I'm the target Dolce & Gabbana market, but that is. I mean, I think that's an important example of taking. There's so many aspects of cultural. It's not just Chinese versus Italian versus U.S. culture or whatever. It's there's many different layers to that.
Yeah.
Always
is. Yeah.
I really liked your point about in global organizations. I began my career at Accenture and worked globally. I think people sometimes forget about, your local team members can be a great place to start. And if you're working in a nonprofit, or impact organization that has a global footprint, chances are you have a great first feedback opportunity with your local team members. I think it's always important to actually go talk to the actual target audience as well too, locally. But sometimes if you have restrictions on resources or the ability to actually achieve that reach to talk to people locally, your team members are a great place to start. And then if you are going to talk to people locally, they're probably going to be the ones who can help you do that.
Yeah, and the lovely thing about them is they understand both sides of the equation, right? They know how your organization works and what your ethos is, and what your internal culture is, but they also know how that will resonate or not with the local culture. And we're talking mainly about geographical things now, but I think this also applies when you're trying to reach a new target market within your local area. Like, let's say you're an impact business that's traditionally reached mostly women, and now you want to attract more men, which is, I think, a big topic within the sustainability space. Then talking to the male members of your team, or even the husbands of the women buying from you, or their brothers or fathers, or even their sons, that might be a good starting point to have a conversation where there is some proximity to what you're already doing, but then also you get that additional viewpoint in, so you can make it less top down and more kind of inside out or bottom up. Involvement's always better, I think, when you want to reach somebody new.
I would agree. And if somebody doesn't have a huge budget and they are resource constrained, I think leveraging your team, but then also there's a real collaboration effort to that, which I talk about a lot at Social Impact CX also. The opportunity to collaboratively work to try and extend the reach of who you're getting input from is really important. And I would say even partner organizations that may be somebody that you're working with in a market or that is different than yours. Maybe you're partnering with somebody who's in a different aspect, who works more so with men, or who works in a different country that you haven't worked with as much. There's opportunities there as well too. And so being resourceful and looking at how you get that input is so important. And the important point, though, is getting as much input to gain as much empathy as you can. I think that's really important.
For sure. You need to really expose yourself to the culture you want to reach emotionally and where you want to resonate. And I think there's different ways. We've talked about the teams. There's, of course, going there. If it's possible for you to immerse yourself in that culture, it's always a great way to do it. But then you can also work with people who are a product of that culture as an external advisor, like me and various other people. Or you can also read up on things. Sometimes stories can really be a bridge between different cultures, movies, books, podcasts, even, where you hear people talk about their experiences. I think all of this can really help with bridge building.
Yeah. So what sort of, I'm interested in how you advise a client, but what sort of fields or industries are you working in with your consultants?
So I work in a really broad field. I don't really like to niche down on just one industry, because for two reasons. On the one hand, I like to get my hands dirty with lots of different things, from financial services to fashion. I've kind of done it all, and I'm always excited about starting afresh. And being that person who asks all the questions. I've actually found it very beneficial not to be a super duper industry expert in just one industry for that reason. And the other thing is, my clients actually quite like that I've got that breadth of experience, and I can transfer knowledge between different industries, and they never feel like my interests might be conflicted because I only work with banks, and therefore, I might have a secret favorite or something like that. It's just not likely to happen.
I think that is great. I think that gets lost sometimes. I try to advise. I spent 20 years in the for-profit technology world, and then 5 years in scaled nonprofit environment here in the States. And I try to talk with people about how, especially if you're in an impact or nonprofit environment, there are examples that you can borrow from other industries. You don't have to create the wheel. You don't have to just start from scratch because you're in this totally unique situation. Many years ago, I found myself as pricing manager for a software company, and we really needed to do something totally new and different because we had entered a new and different market sector. And my first go was borrowing pricing promotions from the airline industry, which is quite different from software, but it's got the conversation going. And what we ended up doing was totally different, but it allowed us to take our brains and put them in a completely different place because the customers we were going after were in a completely different place than what we had been talking about previously.
So really, that's true. Yeah. And I think also what it means is that when I start a project, I always start with asking a lot of questions. I never come with any, like we all come with some sort of assumptions. I can't really say that I'm 100% assumption free, but the likelihood that I will bring assumptions based on my vast experience in this particular sector is lower. I mean, I will know about the regulations and the legal background that I need to know, but I will always go back to the drawing board and ask about this particular company and the client base of that particular company, right? Rather than just starting with assumptions. And I think that's a real plus.
Yeah, I think that's great. So when you are advising a client and when it comes to the general concept of planning for cultural differences in your work or whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish, where do you start? What's first?
Well, I've already mentioned asking questions, and I think that is also because my general approach to all my work is called conversion copywriting. It's not necessarily a term that's very well known, but it's the ideal bridge between cultures. Originally, conversion copywriting was termed conversion as in clicking a button, making a purchase, that kind of conversion. But I also like to use the term in the additional sense of also converting cultural concepts, a bit like a currency conversion or converting centimeters to inches. And what really sets this approach apart is that it always starts with research. It's got a whole lot of UX practices baked in. And so each project starts with learning as much as I can, both about my client and their ideal audience. And that goes through books, academic research, music, films, other cultural artifacts, but most importantly through one-on-one interviews and surveys and that kind of stuff. Gotcha. And even when people just come to me for general advice, I always recommend that they should start there, because that's where you find the places that you need to start from scratch when you're building a new website or a new email sequence that sells some sort of idea or a product or a service.
So do clients typically have an understanding that they need to somehow adapt or evolve or change when it comes to cultural differences, or is that something that you kind of help them through that journey?
A little bit of both. Sometimes they are very aware. Like, for example, right now I'm working with a software engineer who's making software for a group of people who he's not a member of. Like, he has no direct experience of their work environment in which they would use the software and stuff. So he's very aware that these people that he's creating for and selling to and whose practices he's trying to improve are very, very different from himself. But then sometimes I think the questions I ask in the very first conversation open up that new space to think about the work the company is doing slightly differently. And that then creates the awareness and also the desire to dig a little bit deeper.
So this has been Social Impact CX podcast episode 31, which has been part one of my conversation with Sabine Harnau of From Scratch Communications on the subject of cultural differences when doing customer experience work. You can find Sabine online on Twitter. Her handle is @scratch_posts, and her website for her consulting business is from-scratch.net. Do you have thoughts or something to ask after listening to my conversation with Sabine, the first part of it? As always, you can ask a question or make a comment here at Social Impact CX a couple different ways. First, you can send an email to comment@socialimpactcx.com. That's COMMENT @socialimpactcx.com. You can also find us on Twitter and post a question there. Our Twitter handle is @SocialImpactCX. And please follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with new podcasts and other related content. You can find me as well on Twitter and connect with me there. My handle is @JohnFCorrigan. We've expanded where you can find Social Impact CX, and so whether you're listening someplace like Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Play or SoundCloud or YouTube, there's a place to provide a comment or post a question, please do so, and we'll work on keeping up with you there. This is John Corrigan reminding you that, especially in social impact work, it's important to understand that your mission is really all about someone else's journey. And the more you know about someone's journey, the more you can help. Thanks for listening to Social Impact CX.